Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday worship time. It's nice and sunny here this morning in New Brunswick. It was a wicked thunderstorm last night. I hear you guys had lots of weather at home too. So hope everyone is safe and that no one flooded out this time. Our text this morning is from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2 to 10. It says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weakness. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made beneath my weakness. Therefore, I will boast in all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in at least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. May God bless our reading of His holy word. Our message starts this morning describing the one who was named after the gospel writer Mark. It says, when he was born, his mother named him after gospel writer Mark, in hopes that he would tell the truth. But 13th century Europeans found his tales of faraway places impossible to believe. He claimed that at an age of 17, he began an epic journey that lasted a quarter of a century. He traveled across the steppes of Russia, the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, the wastelands of Persia, and over the top to the world known as the Himalayas. He was the first European to enter China, and through an amazing set of circumstances served in the court of the Kublai Khan, and most powerful ruler of earth. What he saw in China absolutely dwarfed anything he had ever seen in Europe. When he returned to Italy, loaded down with gold, silk, and spices, people dismissed his stories as mythical. His family priest rebuked him for spinning lies. At his deathbed, his family and friends begged him to recant his tales of China. But setting his jaw and grasping for breath, Marco Polo stood his final words. I have not even told you half of what I saw. Ironically, history had proven that Marco Polo was truthful about his adventures. Now, 1,300 years before Marco Polo wrote about his adventures, there was another man who wrote of his vision of the glories of heaven in the book of Revelations, and it may well be that he only told of half of what he saw. And I suspect, like Marco Polo, his history will prove that John was truthful about his vision as well. Our text begins today with a similar tale. The Apostle Paul wrote, I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. Our text begins with the Apostle Paul offering up a disclaimer for what he was about to write. He seems embarrassed by the fact that he is actually going to tell about his spiritual experience, because he knows it will sound like he is bragging. But he feels compelled to tell his story nonetheless. It seems others, our spiritual teachers, have come to town and telling the people who made up the church at Corinth how important they were. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Paul's words almost drip with sarcasm when he wrote, "Oh, don't worry. We won't dare say that we are as wonderful as these other men who tell how important they are." Seemingly, people were getting all giddy about the arrival of the latest proponent of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, compliments of Jesus. And the Apostle Paul, who was not exactly chopped liver, was feeling pressured to defend himself as a worthy representative of Jesus Christ. He feels embarrassed to have to defend himself. He is embarrassed that he needed to produce his credentials and drag out his resume in order to get just a little respect. But he reluctantly brought to mind and told the story he had kept to himself for 14 years, a story so magnificent that it forever cemented in the minds of the people in the church of Corinth a lasting appreciation for who he was and how God had intervened in his life. He described his experience as having been caught up in the sky where the birds fly, and then to a higher heaven of the stars and planets, and then beyond, to a third heaven, or paradise. Paul's adventure took him into the depths of the universe, to that place his listeners understood to be paradise. Remember when Jesus spoke to the thief on the cross, assuring him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus was speaking of the place Paul wrote of in this next text. I would place Paul's experience in the category of paranormal or preternatural. The ancient Christian commentaries suggest that the reasons people do not talk about these kind of experiences is because they either are too horrible or too glorious for others to believe. We know people who will not talk about things that are too horrible to recall, much less retell. And sometimes people who have experienced, they are reluctant to tell because they're just too fantastic to believe. And the experience Paul retells in this category was too fantastic for some to believe, because he went to paradise. After 14 years, Paul still could not freely speak of his experience. The word paradise, did you know that it means it's a walled garden? It is typically understood to be a place of beauty and a place of serenity. It was a place where kings walked, and to be invited to walk with the king in his paradise was an unspeakable honor. So what Paul was saying was essentially, I was invited to walk with God in his heavenly garden. And of that experience, he simply wrote, I was caught up into paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. What he saw and heard were not things too horrible to tell, but they were things too sacred to speak about. I think what Paul's readers wanted to know, and what Paul wanted them to know, was that God wants us to know that that paranormal experience is real, and there is a place called paradise that is very much real. But his experience is more in the category of the exception than of the rule. He and we may be able to pluck an experience from 14 years ago that may raise eyebrows and make people wonder what we've been maybe smoking. And those kinds of experiences may perhaps even make people more likely or to think more highly of us. But while those kinds of experiences may certainly change our lives, it is the living life of the real world that establishes and makes us who we are. You can learn a whole lot more about God and the thorns of life than you'll ever learn in the paranormal experience. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 5 through 7, it says, So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan, to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. Now, Paul was an unusual man. He was embarrassed to speak of his credentials for ministry. He did not want to be known as some special kind of Christian, and most certainly, he did not want people adding more to his stature than was to his own. He did not want the plaudits and praise of people. He specifically said in 12:6, I do not want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my messages. But he was also very much a human being. In my reading this week, I came across an interesting comment, and it says the average person believes he is a better person than the average person. Many believe that all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. Social science research reveals we are proud. We think better of ourselves than we really are, and we assume the worst in others while assuming the best in ourselves. The Apostle Paul was apparently not immune to having maybe that touch of pride. I suspect that if I were the rare exception of the rule who is privileged to get a round trip to the third heaven, my head might be a little bit inflated too. We understand, as Paul did, that pride was a way of showing oneself to be above others. To be a proud person is to be arrogant and high-minded. So God allowed Satan to bring into his life what he described as a thorn in his flesh for the very purpose of keeping him humble. What the Apostle Paul experienced was no mere splinter. The word here refers to something that is piercing and deeply embedded in the body. What he experienced was deeply physical. It was obvious and apparent and had an undeniable effect on him physically, emotionally, and spiritually. It was the kind of thing Paul believed was detrimental to his ability to function and serve God. He believed he could serve God better without the affliction than with the affliction. Commentators are quick to offer up ideas as to the nature of his thorn. Some think it was this ugly, disfigured thing. Some think he had chronic flare-ups of malaria. Some think he had poor eyesight. And whatever it was, it must have been disgusting and debilitating and a constant, humble reminder. The vision of heaven was the expectation in Paul's life. Ongoing suffering was the rule of his life. I would guess, as a rule, every one of us has a thorn of some sort in our lives. I would guess that nearly every one of us is living with a circumstance or a situation that we would dearly like to be rid of. And I would guess that nearly every one of us has been struggling with that something for a long time. And I would guess that nearly every one of us believes we would be better off if we were rid of it. We would be happier, healthier, better fitted to serve God if life were different. The Apostle Paul did not like it either. In fact, he said he begged God to remove the thorn 3 times. I think that meant there were 3 extended periods of time when he grappled with it, prayed that God would take it away, but God didn't. Paul's prayer wasn't answered, at least not in the way he had hoped. Instead, he was given an insight into the purpose and the usefulness of his thorn in his flesh. It was to keep him humble. What would it be like if you were rolling in good health, loaded with money, had a great job, a loving spouse, perfect children and grandchildren, lived in a fancy house, drove a high-ended automobile, and everyone was telling you how wonderful you are all the time, and how important you are, how deserving you are, and how much better you are than all the less fortunate and obviously less blessed people by God around you? And what if you actually believed it? Paul wasn't going to be rid of his thorn anytime soon. In fact, God pretty much said, Paul, you're going to have to learn to cope with it, but I will help you do just that. God said in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 8 through 10, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. God assured Paul that though he would not be free of his thorn, that God's grace would be sufficient to help him cope with it. I don't know if you remember the movie. It was back when I was in my teens, I believe. There was a movie about a person who had a very tragic accident, and her name was Joni Eareckson. She broke her neck in a diving accident that left her a quadriplegic. Her thorn is a most useful, most unusual, and particularly deliberating one. No teenager wants to face a lifetime of paralysis, but she went on to be an author, an artist, a noted conference speaker, and she married. She tells of being in a ladies' room during a women's conference when a well-meaning woman who was putting on lipstick in front of the mirror says, "Oh, Joni, You've always looked so together and happy in your wheelchair. I wish I had your joy." Several other ladies agreed, and one asked, "Yes, how do you do it?" And Joni replied, "I don't do it. Let me tell you how it works. After Ken leaves in the morning at 6 a.m., I'm alone until I hear the door open at 7. Then, when a friend arrives to get me up, while I listen to her make coffee, I pray, 'Oh Lord, my friend will soon give me a bath, dress me, sit me up in my chair, brush my hair and teeth, and send me out the door. I don't have the strength to face this routine one more time. I have no resources. I don't even have a smile to take into the day. But you do, Lord. May I have yours. God, I need you so desperately.'" "So what happens then when your friend comes through the bedroom door?" one woman asked, and Joni replied, "I turn my head toward her and give her a smile straight from heaven. It's not mine, it's God's." And so she was gesturing toward her paralyzed legs. Whatever joy you see today was hard won this morning. And so coping is not merely muddling by. It is openly welcoming and receiving the grace of God for a smile when you do not have one. It was an interesting and ironic thing to find that in times of grief that you can be sad and full of joy at the same time. It's an ironic thing to be weak and strong at the same time. That was God's promise to Paul. Weakness and strength will simultaneously be in your life. When we are the weakest, God is the strongest. I think we can readily agree that the power of grace sufficient comes from God. But as Paul finishes out his thoughts on his weakness and God's power, he says something that really grabs my attention. After having prayed 3 times for God to rid him of the thorn, and after God, rather than removing the thorn, promised to give him grace sufficient to cope with it and through it, Paul said, "So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me." Paul was actually finding pleasure in his weakness. He found joy in his suffering, because were it not for the challenges in his life that humbled him and made him weak and needy, he would have never known what it means to experience and live out the power of God. Paul was not nearly as excited about telling and retelling his moment of ecstasy 14 years ago as he thought about acknowledging the presence and the power of God in his day-to-day life. The proof of God's activity in our lives is not so much about the magnificence and the miraculous. It's about the grace that sustains us, even in our weakness. It really is more about the rule than the exception. It's about doing what Joni Eareckson says she does every morning. I turn my head toward her and give her a smile straight from heaven. It's not mine, it's God's. And so she said, gesturing toward her paralyzed legs, whatever joy you see here today was hard won this morning. So now we, too, may say, I am glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. I really wish and pray that the power of Christ works through you and me this day. That as we go about our day, that we will continue to make much of Jesus in every moment and every breath that we have. I wish you all the best in the day and week to come. And until we meet again next week, God bless.